I should have known something was different the moment I saw the lights. Not the way they flashed, red and blue cutting through the darkness like they always do, but the way they appeared behind me on that empty stretch of Highway 9, where nobody drives past midnight except kids like me with nowhere else to go. The road was mine at that hour, had been mine for months. I'd memorized every pothole, every curve, every place where the asphalt cracked and weeds pushed through. It was the only place I could think without the weight of the town pressing down on me. I pulled over before he even hit the siren. My hands found their practice position on the steering wheel, 10 and 2, the way they teach you in driver's ed, but nobody actually does unless they're scared. The engine of my beat-up Honda ticked in the sudden quiet, cooling metal contracting in the October air. Through my rearview mirror, I watched the sheriff's cruiser settle behind me, headlights casting everything in harsh white. My chest tightened, not because I'd done anything wrong. I hadn't been speeding, hadn't been drinking, hadn't even been thinking about anything more dangerous than whether I had enough gas to make it home. But in a town like Cedar Falls, being 23 and driving alone at midnight was suspicious enough. Being 23 and driving alone at midnight when your last name was Moreau meant you were probably up to something your drunk father would hear about by morning. The driver's door of the cruiser opened with a metallic groan that seemed too loud in the stillness. I kept my eyes forward, watching his approach in my side mirror. Sheriff Clark Bennett moved like a man who'd done this 1,000 times, unhurried but purposeful, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. He was taller than I remembered from the few times I'd seen him around town, broader too, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. When he reached my window, I rolled it down and felt the October cold rush in. He leaned down, and for the first time in months, I was close enough to see his face clearly. Mid-40s, maybe older, with lines carved deep around his eyes and a jaw that looked like it rarely relaxed. His hair was darker than it appeared from a distance, threaded with silver that caught the light from his cruiser. Everything about him suggested authority, control, the kind of presence that made people straighten up without thinking about it. But his voice, when it came, was softer than I expected. License and registration. He should have said, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The standard script that every cop in every small town had memorized. Instead, he studied my face for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Get in," he said. I blinked up at him, certain I'd misheard. The words didn't make sense, didn't fit the situation. Get in where? Get in why? But when I looked into his eyes, gray, I realized, though the darkness made them seem almost black, there was something there that made the question stick in my throat. "I'm sorry, what?" "Get in the cruiser," he repeated, straightening up. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, just there, steady and sure. Now, every instinct had told me to ask why, to demand an explanation, to point out that I hadn't been doing anything illegal, that he had no right to order me anywhere. But there was something in his tone that bypassed all of that, something that made me turn off my engine and reach for the door handle before I'd fully decided to comply. The walk from my car to his felt longer than it should have. The night air bit through my jacket, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant promise of winter. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the asphalt. Behind us, my Honda sat empty and somehow vulnerable, its hazard lights blinking in a rhythm that felt urgent. The passenger side of the cruiser was different from any police car I'd imagined. Cleaner, somehow. The radio murmured softly, dispatches from a world that felt very far away. The seats were worn but comfortable, and the dashboard glowed with a dozen small lights I couldn't identify. When I settled into the seat and reached for the door handle to close it, I heard the locks engage with a sound that seemed to echo in the confined space. The sound felt final. Sheriff Bennett climbed into the driver's seat without explanation. Up close, in the dim light from the dashboard, I could see more of him. The way his uniform shirt pulled slightly across his shoulders. The careful way he moved, like a man conscious of taking up space. His hands on the steering wheel were broad, calloused. The hands of someone who'd done more than push papers and write tickets. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat there, staring out at the empty road ahead of us. The silence stretched between us, thick and strange. I wanted to ask what this was about, wanted to demand answers, wanted to do something other than sit there breathing in the scent of leather and gun oil, and something else I couldn't name. But I didn't. Maybe it was the authority he carried, or maybe it was something else. The way the quiet felt deliberate rather than awkward, like he was giving us both time to adjust to whatever this was. The radio crackled occasionally, distant voices reporting on a world that suddenly seemed very far away from the inside of this car. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that I had to lean slightly toward him to hear it clearly. You weren't speeding. It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. I just nodded, keeping my eyes on the windshield on the way our headlights cut through the darkness ahead. You weren't drinking either, he continued. Weren't texting. Weren't doing anything that gave me cause to pull you over. The admission hung between us. I waited for the explanation, for him to tell me why I was sitting in his cruiser with the doors locked if I hadn't done anything wrong. But it didn't come. Instead, he reached forward and turned on the engine. The car hummed to life around us, and I felt rather than saw him check his mirrors before pulling back onto the road. We weren't heading toward the station. I knew that much immediately. The sheriff's department was back toward town, and we were driving deeper into the countryside. The headlights swept over familiar landmarks, made strange by the late hour and the circumstances. The old Miller farm, dark and abandoned. The turnoff for the lake, where teenagers went to drink and pretend they were braver than they were. Roads I'd driven 100 times, but never as a passenger. Never locked inside a police cruiser with a man I'd barely spoken to in all my years living in Cedar Falls. My pulse had settled into something steadier than panic, but faster than calm. There was something surreal about the whole situation, something that made me feel like I was watching it happen to someone else. The speedometer held steady at 35. The radio continued its quiet chatter. Outside, the world moved past us in the measured way that things do when you're not in control of where you're going. I found myself studying Sheriff Bennett's profile in the dashboard light. The strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes stayed focused on the road ahead. There was something almost careful about the way he drove, like he was giving himself time to think, or like he wasn't entirely sure where we were going either. The silence had weight to it, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt deliberate, important somehow, like we were both waiting for something, though I couldn't have said what. The locked doors that had seemed threatening at first began to feel different, not like confinement, but like privacy, like protection from a world that suddenly felt very far away. When he finally slowed down, it was to turn onto a dirt road I'd never noticed before, barely more than a track that wound between stands of oak and maple. The headlights swept across trees that seemed to close in around us, their branches creating a canopy overhead that blocked out even the faint light from the stars. He drove for maybe another mile before pulling over in a small clearing where the trees opened up enough to reveal the sky. When he turned off the engine, the silence that followed was complete. No radio, no road noise, no distant sounds of civilization. Just the cooling tick of the engine and the soft whisper of wine through the leaves above us. I waited. Whatever this was, whatever had brought us here, I sensed that it was his move to make. The dashboard lights faded gradually, leaving us in a darkness that was somehow warmer than the harsh illumination of the traffic stop. In the growing quiet, I became aware of my own breathing, of the way my heart had settled into a rhythm that felt almost calm. Finally, Sheriff Bennett turned in his seat to look at me directly. In the faint light filtering through the windshield, his face was softer than it had been under the streetlights, the hard lines of authority replaced by something more human, more uncertain. "I saw you out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Driving alone. Late." The words carried weight I didn't understand yet, implications that hovered just beyond my comprehension. I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something in his tone that I'd never heard before from anyone in uniform, anyone in authority. "You look like you needed someone," he added, and the admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did me. And in that moment, sitting in a police cruiser in a clearing I'd never seen before with a man I'd barely known existed, I realized that he was right. I had needed someone. I just hadn't known it until he said it. The words hung between us in the darkness, and I found myself unable to look away from his face. "You look like you needed someone." It was such a simple statement, but it cut through everything I'd been telling myself about my late-night drives, about the restlessness that had been eating at me for months. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew your story before you had a chance to write it yourself. Population 8,400, give or take whoever had graduated and fled for bigger cities that year. I'd grown up here, gone to Cedar Falls High with the same kids I'd known since kindergarten, worked the same summer jobs at the same family businesses that had been operating since my father was young. It was the kind of town that looked picturesque on postcards and felt like a trap when you were 23 with no clear path forward. My world had shrunk to a handful of familiar places. Morrison's Hardware, where I picked up shifts whenever old Pete needed an extra pair of hands. The apartment above the bakery that I rented from Mrs. Chun, barely big enough for a bed and a hot plate, but cheap enough that I could afford it on a regular pay. The gas station on Route 12 where I bought coffee at midnight, because sleep never came easy and the fluorescent lights made me feel less alone. And the roads. Always the roads. I've been driving these back highways since I got my license at 16, but something had changed in the past year. What started as weekend drives to clear my head had become a nightly ritual. I'd finish whatever work I could find, eat dinner standing over my kitchen sink, and then climb into my Honda and drive until the gas gauge made me turn around. Sometimes I'd end up at the lake, sitting on the hood of my car watching the water. Other times I'd drive the perimeter roads that circled the county, windows down, music low, trying to outrun thoughts that followed me everywhere else. The drives weren't about going anywhere. They were about moving, about being in motion when everything else in my life felt stagnant. In the car, with the familiar roads unspooling ahead of me, I could pretend I was heading somewhere that mattered. I could pretend the tightness in my chest was anticipation instead of loneliness. But Sheriff Bennett had seen through all of that with a single glance. Clark Bennett had been sheriff longer than I'd been old enough to pay attention to local politics. He'd taken office when I was still in high school, running unopened after the previous sheriff retired to Florida and left behind a department that needed steady hands. People in Cedar Falls liked their authority figures to be predictable, reliable, and Bennett fit the role perfectly. He was the kind of man you'd expect to see in a sheriff's uniform, tall, serious, with the sort of presence that made people think twice before running red lights or getting too loud outside the bars on Friday night. But that was all I really knew about him before that night. He was a figure of authority, someone you nodded to respectfully if you passed him on the street, someone whose presence at the 4th of July barbecue or the high school football games reminded everyone that order was being maintained. He lived alone in a house on Maple Street that he kept immaculately maintained, drove the same route through town at the same times each day, and gave the impression of a man who had his life arranged exactly as he wanted it. Now, sitting next to him in the quiet clearing, I realized I'd never really looked at him before. Not as a person. In the soft light filtering through the trees, I could see things I'd missed during our brief encounters in town. The way his jaw tightened slightly when he was thinking. The careful way he held his shoulders, like he was always conscious of the space he occupied. His hands resting on the steering wheel, broad and capable, with a thin gold band on his right ring finger that caught the light when he moved. The silence between us had settled into something almost comfortable. Not the awkward quiet of strangers forced together, but the measured stillness of two people trying to figure out what came next. The radio had gone quiet, and outside the car, I could hear the soft sounds of the forest settling around us. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying clearly in the still air. I should have been nervous, should have been demanding answers, asking why a sheriff had driven me to an isolated clearing in the middle of the night. But instead, I found myself oddly calm. There was something about Bennett's presence that felt steady rather than threatening. Something about the way he'd spoken those words. You look like you needed someone, that suggested he understood more about loneliness than his reputation implied. Cedar Falls was a place where people minded their own business until Sunday morning, when the week's gossip got passed around the churches like communion wine. Everyone knew who was having money troubles, who was drinking too much, who was stepping out on their spouse. But some secrets ran deeper than the town's gossip network could reach. Some kinds of loneliness were too quiet, too private, to make it into the weekly circulation of who was doing what to whom. Bennett turned slightly in his seat, and I caught him studying my profile the same way I'd been studying his. When our eyes met, he didn't look away immediately the way most people did. Instead, he held my gaze for a moment that felt longer than it probably was, and I saw something in his expression that I recognized because I'd seen it in my own reflection during those late-night drives. The recognition was mutual, I realized. Whatever he'd seen in me driving alone at midnight, whatever need he'd identified, it was something he understood because he felt it too. He started the engine without explanation, the sound seeming unnaturally loud after the extended quiet. As we pulled back on the dirt road, I found myself watching the trees close and around us again, and I wondered if this was how it always happened. If the moments that changed your life always began with someone seeing something in you that you've been trying to hide from everyone else. The drive back to my car felt different from the drive out. Shorter, somehow, but weighted with possibility. When we reached the spot where my Honda waited with its hazard lights still blinking, Bennett pulled up behind it, but didn't immediately unlock the doors. "You'll be out driving again tomorrow night," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. "So will I," he replied, and something in his tone made it clear that this wasn't a threat or a warning. It was something else entirely. When the locks finally disengaged, the sound seemed to echo in the space between us. The next night, I found myself driving the same route without consciously deciding to. Muscle memory guided my hands on the steering wheel, following the familiar curves of Highway 9 past the Miller farm, past the lake turnoff, past all the landmarks that had become waypoints in my nightly ritual of motion without destination. But everything felt different now, charged with the possibility of those flashing lights appearing in my rearview mirror again. They didn't come that first night. I drove until nearly 2 in the morning, taking longer routes, slower speeds, giving every opportunity for another encounter that never materialized. When I finally headed home, I told myself I was relieved. The rational part of my mind insisted that one strange midnight meeting with the sheriff was enough, that whatever had happened in that clearing was an anomaly best left unexplored. But I was back out there the following night and the night after that. It became a pattern over the next 2 weeks. Some nights, I drove alone, windows down, radio low, the October air growing colder as autumn deepened toward winter. Other nights, just when I'd begun to think the encounter had been a one-time occurrence, I'd catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirrors that stayed a careful distance behind me, never quite close enough to be obvious, but present enough that I knew I wasn't alone on the empty roads. The first time it happened, my pulse spiked with the same nervous energy I'd felt during that initial traffic stop. But as the headlights followed me through turn after turn, maintaining that respectful distance, never flashing or signaling, but simply there, I began to understand that this was something else entirely. Not pursuit, but accompaniment. 2 vehicles moving through the darkness in a strange kind of synchrony, connected by something neither of us had named yet. On the nights when the headlights appeared, I found myself driving differently, more deliberately. I'd take routes that led to the quieter back roads, away from the county highway, where other late-night travelers might intrude on whatever this was becoming. Sometimes I'd pull into the parking lot of the abandoned diner on Route 47, and the other car would park at the far end, far enough away to maintain the pretense of coincidence, but close enough that I could see the silhouette of Sheriff Bennett behind the wheel of his cruiser. We never spoke during those early encounters, never approached each other's vehicles, but the silence felt communicative, like we were both learning the rules of a game that neither of us had played before. I'd sit in my car, engine running, and feel the weight of his attention across the empty parking lot. Sometimes I'd see the brief glow of a cigarette lighter, a small flame illuminating his face for just a moment before disappearing back into the darkness. The strangest part was how natural it began to feel. These midnight meetings that weren't quite meetings, this careful dance of 2 people circling around something they couldn't yet acknowledge directly. During the day, when I'd see his cruiser parked outside the courthouse or catch a glimpse of him in uniform at Murphy's Cafe, we'd nod with the same polite distance we'd always maintained. But at night, on the empty roads, we existed in a different space where the normal rules of Cedar Falls didn't seem to apply. 3 weeks after that first encounter, everything changed. I was parked behind the old grain elevator, a spot I discovered that offered a view of the valley below while staying hidden from the main road. It had become one of my regular stops during these late drives, a place where I could sit with my thoughts and watch the occasional set of headlights move across the landscape like slow-moving stars. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes when I saw the familiar shape of the sheriff's cruiser pull into the gravel lot. But this time, instead of parking at his usual careful distance, Bennett drove directly toward my car. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled up beside me, driver's side to driver's side, close enough that when we both rolled down our windows, less than 3 feet separated us. The cool night air carried the scent of his cigarette smoke and something else, something warmer that might have been cologne or might have just been the particular smell of leather and authority that seemed to cling to him. In the dim light from our dashboards, I could see his profile more clearly than I had since that night in the clearing. "You're becoming predictable," he said, his voice carrying easily across the small distance between our cars. It was the first time he'd spoken to me since that initial encounter, and hearing his voice again sent an unexpected jolt through me. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. Like coming home to a place you'd forgotten you were homesick for. "So are you," I replied, surprising myself with my boldness. He turned to look at me then, fully, and in the faint light, I could see something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not just the careful authority he wore during the day, but something more vulnerable, more human. The sheriff's uniform looked different on him in the darkness, less like armor and more like just clothes that happened to signify his day job. "This can't keep happening," he said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "What can't keep happening?" I asked, though I thought I understood what he meant. This careful circling, this midnight courtship that wasn't quite a courtship, this growing connection that neither of us had been willing to name. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing bright orange in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more careful. "You know what?" And I didn't know. I knew that whatever was building between us in these late-night encounters was moving towards something that would require choices, decisions that couldn't be made from the safety of separate vehicles parked just close enough to pretend we weren't really meeting at all. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Heavier, like we'd finally acknowledged the weight of what we'd been dancing around for weeks, and now that weight was settling between us, demanding attention. When he finally started his engine, I expected him to drive away like he always did, to retreat back into the careful distance that had defined these encounters. Instead, he gestured toward the road ahead. "Follow me," he said simply. And without hesitation, I did. I followed his taillights deeper into the countryside than I'd ever driven before, past roads I didn't recognize, through territory that felt more remote with each mile. The red glow of his brake lights became my guide through turns I would never have found on my own, leading us away from anything that resembled civilization and towards something that felt like the edge of the known world. He drove with purpose now, no longer the careful, measured pace of our previous encounters. This wasn't the uncertain dance we'd been performing for weeks, but something more decisive, more intentional. Whatever had shifted between us in that moment when he'd asked me to follow, it had changed the rules of engagement completely. The road narrowed to little more than 2 tire tracks separated by a strip of grass that scraped against the undercarriage of my Honda. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel overhead that blocked out most of the starlight. In the distance ahead, Bennett's cruiser moved like a ghost through the darkness, its outline barely visible except for those steady red points of light that had become my anchor in the unfamiliar landscape. After what felt like miles but might have been minutes, the trees began to thin, and I could see open sky ahead. We emerged into a clearing larger than the one where we'd had our first real conversation. This one bordered by what looked like an old stone foundation, the remnants of some building that had long since been reclaimed by the forest. Bennett's cruiser crunched to a stop on the gravel that remained scattered around the ruins, and I pulled up beside him, close enough this time that there was no pretense of accidental proximity. When we both killed our engines, the silence that followed was absolute. No radio chatter, No distant traffic, no sound from the civilized world we'd left behind. Just the cooling tick of metal and the soft whisper of wind through the grass that had grown up between the old foundation stones. Bennett got out of his car first, and I watched through my windshield as he walked to the front of his cruiser and leaned against the hood. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face before disappearing back into the darkness. The gesture seemed casual, but there was something deliberate about it, like an invitation extended without words. I took a breath and opened my door. The night air was colder here, sharp with the promise of winter and tinged with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the gravel as I walked around to where Bennett stood, close enough now that I could see the rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers held his cigarette with practiced ease. "Nice spot," I said, though the words felt inadequate for the moment. He nodded toward the stone foundation. Used to be a farmhouse. Been gone maybe 40 years, but the foundation's still solid. It was the most he'd said to me at one time since this whole thing started, and I found myself studying his profile as he spoke. In the faint light from his cruiser's headlights, I could see details I'd missed before. The way his hair was just starting to gray at the temples. The small scar that ran along his jawline, barely visible unless you were close enough to notice. The careful way he held himself, like a man who was used to being watched and judged. "You've been here before," I said. He took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Sometimes, when I need to think." The admission felt significant, like he was sharing something more personal than directions to a secluded spot. This wasn't just somewhere he'd brought me for privacy. This was somewhere he came when he needed to escape, when the weight of being Sheriff Bennett became too much, and he needed to remember what it felt like to be just Clark. "What do you think about?" The question was out before I could consider whether I had the right to ask it. He turned to look at me then, and even in the dim light, I could see something shifting in his expression. The careful mask of authority he wore during the day was gone, replaced by something more raw, more uncertain. He said simply, "I think about you." The words hit me like a physical force, not because they were unexpected exactly, but because hearing them spoken aloud made them real in a way that all our careful circling hadn't. For weeks we'd been dancing around this thing between us, approaching it sideways, never quite acknowledging what was happening. But now, standing in this isolated clearing with 40 years of abandoned dreams scattered around us in stone and mortar, there was nowhere left to hide. "I don't understand this," I said, and my voice sounded smaller than I'd intended. "I don't understand what we're doing." Bennett dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel, the gesture somehow final. When he looked up at me again, I could see something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just want, though that was there too, but something deeper. Something that looked like longing held so long it had worn grooves in his soul. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I can't stop." He pushed off from the cruiser and took a step toward me, close enough now that I could smell the tobacco on his breath and the faint scent of his cologne. Close enough that when he reached out and touched my face with fingers that trembled slightly, I could feel the warmth of his skin against mine. "I should walk away," he said, his thumb tracing along my cheekbone. "Should get in my car and drive home and pretend this never happened." "But you won't," I said, and it wasn't really a question. "No," he whispered. "I won't." When he leaned forward and pressed his lips to mine, it felt like the most natural thing in the world and the most impossible thing that had ever happened. His mouth was warm and soft and tasted of cigarettes and something else I couldn't name, but immediately wanted more of. The kiss was tentative at first, questioning like he was giving me every opportunity to pull away. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands finding the front of his uniform shirt and gripping the fabric like an anchor. The kiss deepened, became something urgent and desperate, like we were both drowning and had suddenly discovered we could breathe each other's air. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Bennett rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, and I could feel the tension in his body, the war being fought between what he wanted and what he thought he should do. "This changes everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied, because I did. There was no going back from this moment, No returning to the careful distance we'd maintained before. Whatever we were to each other now, it was something that would require choices, decisions that neither of us was prepared to make, but that we'd have to face anyway. The abandoned foundation around us seemed like the perfect metaphor for what we were building. Something constructed on the ruins of what came before, something that might not last, but felt essential in the moment of its creation. The days that followed our first kiss moved like a slow-burning fuse, each hour bringing us closer to something that felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. We didn't speak about what had happened at the abandoned farmhouse, but the knowledge of it hung between us like a charged wire, dangerous to touch but impossible to ignore. Our nighttime meetings became more frequent, more deliberate. Bennett would appear behind me on the back roads with a single flash of his headlights, and I'd follow him to places I'd never seen before. An old quarry where the water reflected the stars like a mirror. A meadow where deer grazed in the moonlight, lifting their heads to watch our headlights pass. A ridge overlooking the valley where cedar falls looked like a handful of scattered jewels in the darkness below. But we were more careful now, more aware of what we were risking. He never pulled up beside me like he had that night at the grain elevator. Instead, we'd park at opposite ends of whatever clearing he'd chosen, maintaining a distance that looked accidental to anyone who might stumble across us. We'd sit in our separate cars, engines running, and I'd feel the weight of his attention across the space between us like a physical thing. The restraint was killing both of us. I could see it in the rigid way he held his shoulders when he got out to smoke a cigarette, in the careful way he avoided looking directly at me when our paths crossed in town during daylight hours. At Morrison's Hardware, I'd be stocking shelves when he'd come in for something routine, batteries for his flashlight, motor oil for the cruiser, and we'd exchange the same polite nods we'd always shared, but now the air between us crackled with everything we weren't saying. 3 weeks after that first kiss, everything came to a head. I was working late at the hardware store, helping Pete with inventory, when Bennett walked in just before closing time. The bell above the door announced his arrival, and something in the sound made me look up from the clipboard I'd been studying. He moved through the narrow aisles with his usual measured pace, but there was something different about him tonight. Something tense and urgent that I could feel even from across the store. Pete was in the back office, dealing with paperwork and muttering about suppliers who couldn't count, which left Bennett and me alone among the shelves of tools and farm equipment. He made a show of examining a display of work gloves, but I could feel his attention focused on me like a laser. When I walked over to ask if he needed help, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to burn in the fluorescent light. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the back office. "Here?" I asked, glancing toward the windows where anyone walking past could see us. "No. Meet me at the old McKenzie place in an hour." The McKenzie place was a farmhouse that had been empty for years, sitting on a dirt road that nobody used anymore except for teenagers looking for a place to drink beer and pretend they were more rebellious than they actually were. It was more isolated than anywhere we'd met before, more private, and the look in Bennett's eyes told me that privacy was exactly what he needed. I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady, and watched him leave without buying anything, the bell marking his departure with the same finality as a closing door. The hour that followed felt like the longest of my life. I finished helping Pete close up the store, drove home to my apartment above the bakery, and sat on my bed staring at the clock until it was time to leave. When I finally got back in my car, my hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel, though whether from anticipation or fear, I couldn't say. The McKenzie place sat at the end of a quarter-mile driveway, hidden from the road by a stand of pine trees that had grown wild in the years since anyone had tended them. Bennett's cruiser was already there when I arrived, parked close to the sagging front porch of the old farmhouse. He was leaning against the hood, smoking, and when my headlights swept across him, I could see the tension in every line of his body. I parked next to him and got out, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my arms. We stood there for a moment in the space between our cars, close enough to touch, but not quite touching, like two magnets held just far enough apart to feel the pull without making contact. "You can't keep looking at me like that," he said finally, his voice rough around the edges. "Like what?" Like you know exactly what I'm thinking about when I'm supposed to be doing my job. The admission hung between us, raw and honest. I thought about all the times over the past few weeks when our eyes had met across the hardware store, at the gas station, in the courthouse parking lot, and how each glance had felt like a small rebellion against the roles we were supposed to play. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. He dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel with more force than necessary. When he looked up at me, his face was a study in conflict, desire warring with duty, want battling against everything he'd been taught about propriety and position. "You," he said, the word coming out like a confession torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I think about kissing you again. I think about what it would feel like to touch you without looking over my shoulder to see who might be watching. I think about things that could cost me everything I've worked for." The honesty in his voice stripped away all pretense, all the careful distance we'd been maintaining. This wasn't just attraction anymore, wasn't just the pull of something forbidden. This was a man admitting that he was willing to risk everything he'd built for something he'd found with me in the darkness. "Then why are we standing here talking about it?" I asked, taking a step toward him. He reached for me then, his hands finding my face like they had that night at the farmhouse. But this time there was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries. When he kissed me, it was with the desperation of a man who'd been holding his breath for weeks and had finally been given permission to exhale. The kiss was deeper than the first one, hungrier, full of all the want we'd been carrying around like a secret weight. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I could see something in his eyes that looked like surrender. "I can't be seen with you," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "Not like this. Not in this town." "Then we don't let them see us," I replied, because suddenly it seemed like the simplest thing in the world. The decision to keep meeting in secret should have felt like a compromise, but instead it felt like choosing to breathe. Standing there in the shadow of the abandoned Mackenzie house, Bennett's hands still cupping my face, I realized that walking away had never really been an option for either of us. We'd been circling this moment for weeks, and now that we'd finally landed in it, the only choice was how far we were willing to fall. What followed was a month of living double lives with the precision of spies. During the day, we maintained the careful distance that Cedar Falls expected from its sheriff and one of its more unremarkable young men. Bennett would nod politely when he came into Morrison's hardware, ask about motor oil or flashlight batteries with the same professional courtesy he'd always shown. I'd hand him his receipt and thank him for his business, and anyone watching would see nothing more than a routine transaction between a law enforcement officer and a local merchant. But at night, we became different people entirely. We developed a language of signals that felt like our own secret code. A single flash of headlights on a back road meant follow me. Parking at opposite ends of a clearing meant we needed to be careful, that he'd seen another car or heard radio chatter that suggested other people might be in the area. When he lit a cigarette and let the smoke drift toward my car, it meant the coast was clear, that we could risk getting closer. The abandoned farmhouse became our sanctuary. Week after week, we'd meet there in the darkness, two cars parked close enough that we could talk without raising our voices, far enough from any traveled road that discovery felt impossible. Sometimes we'd sit on the hood of his cruiser, looking up at stars that seemed brighter away from the town's scattered streetlights. Other times we'd walk among the old foundation stones, and Bennett would tell me stories about the family that had lived there, details he'd learned from old-timers who remembered when the house was still standing. But mostly, we'd find excuses to touch each other. It started small, his hand brushing against mine when we both reached for something, my fingers finding his when we stood close enough that accidental contact became inevitable. Each touch felt electric, charged with all the restraint we had to exercise everywhere else. When he'd finally pull me closer, when we'd give in to what we'd been wanting since our last meeting, it felt like the most natural thing in the world and the most dangerous thing we could imagine. The night everything changed, Bennett seemed different from the moment I saw his headlights appear behind me on Route 9. He was driving faster than usual, more urgently, and when he flashed his lights to signal that I should follow, there was something almost desperate about the gesture. I followed him to the farmhouse, but instead of our usual careful approach, he parked directly in front of the old foundation and got out of his car before I'd even turned off my engine. When I joined him, I could see tension radiating from every line of his body. He was pacing among the foundation stones, smoking with the quick, nervous movements of a man who'd been pushed past his breaking point. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He stopped pacing and looked at me, and in the faint light from our headlights, I could see something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Not just want or conflict, but something that looked like desperation. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice rough. "I can't keep pretending during the day that nothing's happening between us, then coming out here at night and pretending that it doesn't matter." The words hit me like cold water. I'd known this moment would come eventually, had been dreading it since our first kiss, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that all my worried thoughts hadn't. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I was afraid. I already knew. "I'm saying I can't keep living like this. Split down the middle. Half of me try to be the sheriff this town expects, half of me wanting to be with you. It's killing me." He took a step toward me, and I could see something breaking apart in his face, all the careful control he'd maintained for weeks finally cracking under the pressure. "I think about you all the time," he continued, his voice getting quieter, more intense. "When I'm writing reports, when I'm patrolling downtown, when I'm sitting in church on Sunday morning, pretending to listen to Pastor Morrison talk about righteousness and moral duty. You're always there in the back of my mind, and I can't concentrate on anything else." The confession hung between us like a challenge. This wasn't just about desire anymore, wasn't just about stolen moments in abandoned places. This was about a man who'd built his entire adult life around duty and service, admitting that he'd found something that mattered more than his reputation, more than his job, maybe even more than his safety. "But that's not the worst part," he said, taking another step closer. "The worst part is that I don't want to stop. Even knowing what it could cost me, even knowing that someone could see us, could put together what's happening and destroy everything I've worked for. I still come out here every night hoping you'll be here too." The honesty in his voice stripped away every defense I had. This wasn't a man who was afraid of what we were doing anymore. This was a man who'd weighed the costs and decided that losing me would be worse than losing everything else. I walked to him then, closing the distance between us in 3 quick steps, and when I reached up to touch his face, I could feel the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his breath caught when my fingers found his skin. "Then don't stop," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "Don't stop coming here. Don't stop wanting this." When he kissed me this time, it was different from all the others. Not desperate or stolen or careful, but certain. Like a man who'd made a choice and was finally at peace with it. His hands found the small of my back and pulled me closer, and I could feel the solid warmth of his body against mine, could smell the familiar scent of tobacco and leather and something that was just him. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel something settling between us, something that felt like commitment made without words. "This could ruin both of us," he said quietly. "I know," I replied, because I did, but standing there in the darkness with his arms around me, ruin felt like a small price to pay for whatever this was we'd found together. The choice had been made, not just to continue meeting in secret, but to let this thing between us grow into whatever it was going to become. Consequences be damned. What followed that night of choosing each other was not the dramatic unraveling I'd feared, but something quieter, more profound. We settled into a rhythm that felt less like secrecy and more like sanctuary. The abandoned farmhouse became our world, a place where Sheriff Clark Bennett could transform back into just Clark, where the weight of authority and expectation could fall away like a uniform shed at the end of a long shift. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a blanket of snow that muffled sound and made our midnight meetings feel even more isolated from the rest of the world. The old foundation stones disappeared under drifts that turned the ruins into gentle hills, and our footprints were the only evidence that anyone had disturbed the pristine landscape. On the coldest nights, we'd sit in Bennett's cruiser with the heater running, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, far enough apart that we could still pretend this was innocent if anyone stumbled across us. but pretense was becoming harder to maintain, even between ourselves. The night I realized how completely everything had changed, we'd been meeting for nearly 2 months. Bennett had arrived at the farmhouse before me, and when I pulled up, I could see him standing among the snow-covered stones, his breath visible in small puffs of vapor that disappeared as quickly as they formed. He wasn't smoking, wasn't pacing, just standing still in the falling snow like he was waiting for something. When I joined him, he turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the careful authority of Sheriff Bennett, not the conflicted desire of a man fighting his own wants, but something calmer, more resolved. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the muffled quiet of the snowfall. I waited, because I'd learned that Bennett's thoughts came slowly, carefully considered before they were shared. "About what people would say if they knew," he continued. "About what I'd lose if this came out. My job, probably. My reputation, definitely. The respect of people who've known me for years." The words should have frightened me, should have reminded me of all the reasons this was dangerous for both of us. Instead, I found myself stepping closer, drawn by something in his tone that suggested this wasn't the beginning of an ending, but something else entirely. "And?" I asked. "And I realized I don't care anymore," he said simply. "I used to think my job was the most important thing in my life. I used to think that being Sheriff Bennett was who I was, not just what I did. But standing here with you, I know that's not true anymore." He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine with the easy familiarity that had developed over weeks of stolen touches. His skin was cold from the winter air, but his grip was warm, steady, certain. "You've become more important to me than any of that," he said. "More important than what people think, more important than keeping up appearances, more important than playing it safe." The confession settled between us like the snow, quiet and transformative. This wasn't just about choosing to continue our secret meetings anymore. This was about a fundamental shift in what mattered, about priorities reordered in a way that couldn't be undone. "I love you," I said, the words coming out before I'd consciously decided to speak them. It was the first time either of us had used that word, but it felt like something that had been true for weeks, waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. He smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile I'd ever seen from him. And when he leaned down to kiss me, it tasted like relief and snow and the promise of whatever came next. "I love you too," he said against my lips, and the words seemed to echo in the quiet clearing, settling into the landscape around us like they belonged there. We stayed at the farmhouse longer than usual that night, talking about things we'd never dared to discuss before. Not just the immediate logistics of keeping this secret, but the future, the possibility that someday we might not have to hide. Bennett talked about retirement still years away, about what it might be like to leave Cedar Falls for somewhere less familiar, somewhere we could be just two people who'd found each other instead of the sheriff and the hardware store clerk who weren't supposed to want what we wanted. When we finally drove back toward town, Bennett leading the way as he always did, something had fundamentally shifted. The careful distance between our vehicles felt different now. Not like separation, but like a shared secret we were both protecting. At the intersection where we usually parted ways, he pulled over and waited for me to draw up beside him. "Tomorrow night?" he asked through his open window, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not uncertainty or conflict, but anticipation. "Tomorrow night," I confirmed, and watched him smile before he drove away toward his empty house on Maple Street. As I drove back to my apartment above the bakery, I found myself thinking about that first night when he'd pull me over for no reason, when he'd told me I looked like I needed someone. It seemed like a lifetime ago, that moment of connection between two people who didn't yet understand what they were reaching for in the darkness. Now I knew. We'd been reaching for each other, across the space that separated the life we were supposed to live from the life we actually wanted. And somehow, against all the odds and expectations, we'd managed to close that distance. The snow continued to fall as I parked behind the bakery, covering my windshield and erasing the tire tracks that might have told the story of where I'd been. But the story itself was written now, inscribed somewhere deeper than tracks in snow, permanent in a way that weather couldn't touch. In the morning, we'd return to our daytime roles, Sheriff Bennett and the hardware store clerk, maintaining the careful distance that Cedar Falls expected. But tonight had proven that distance was just performance now, just something we did to protect what we'd built together in the hidden places. And what we'd built felt strong enough to last.